From NASA's Ingenuity mission and all the other previous space operations, the collected information about Mars was thoroughly studied to prepare for a new expedition. In order to have a closer look at the red planet, Operation Echo was launched. A private robotic engineering company I was working for called Zeal was commissioned to build a highly advanced drone that was capable of doing multiple tasks while surviving the foreign terrain. With these goals in mind, the land drone Echo was built. Equipped with advanced intelligence to act independently if necessary, the Echo was a modular drone with high resistance to cold. It had everything it needed to initiate a geophysical survey on its own. It could perform the same tasks that the NASA's Perseverance rover did, and more. It was designed to record a detailed topographic map and explore as far as it physically could. Echo was also capable of analyzing mineral samples and reading seismic data. But the most special feat of this intelligent machine was its capability to deploy burrowing probes that could drill through the red sands and make a map of whatever was underneath the surface. Because of its remarkable versatility and unique capabilities, Project Echo was able to unfurl the greatest discovery in Mars that piqued everyone's curiosity. At the mountainous section of Mars called the Flagramontes, there was a particular rock formation which they referred to as the Gourd. Because of its shape, composed of two conjoined, gigantic mounds, nobody would have thought that it was anything more than a part of the dreary landscape. Everybody was shocked when the Echo drone dug through it and discovered that it was hollow. They learned that this particular rock formation was not a mountain, but a dome buried in heaps of sand. Aside from its high ceiling, the floor was buried roughly 50 feet below the surface. Inside this structure were significant signs of an ancient civilization. The floor looked like a polished black granite that was too hard for Echo's drills to penetrate. The curved walls did not have any visible crevices or signs of stacking, which suggested that the entire structure was carved from a single solid rock. There were peculiar carvings all over the walls, but they were too high for the land drone to scan clearly. About 20 feet from the floor, there was a ring of ledge around the upper part of the dome that had enough space to stand on. It looked like it was just part of the design, since there was no visible way to reach its height. The most intriguing piece inside the structure was a giant stone throne at the extending area of the dome, which made it look like a gourd above the surface. There was a stone door that was roughly 10 feet high, and it was also embellished with intricate carvings. It was no longer accessible from the outside, since it was buried in sand, but one would question how they could possibly move such a heavy piece of slab back then. It was unclear what the purpose of the place originally was. The empty space, the oversized pieces, and the shape of the structure suggested that it might have been a temple, but the giant empty stone throne made it look like some kind of throne room. Whatever the case may be, this discovery was conclusive evidence that an advanced community had once lived on the planet. Due to this breakthrough, a follow-up expedition was funded unsparingly by a collaboration of different space agencies around the world. It takes 26 months for Mars and Earth to align, and they made sure not to miss the window of opportunity. More Echo units were made and modified to perform better than the first model, and they sent it to the Red Planet after 2 years and 2 months. In the same level of excitement as the space travel agencies had, the people also began to spread their own assumptions about what was discovered. Since NASA's recent findings were open to the public for the sake of transparency and to garner support, the footage inside the court spread quickly like a wildfire and inspired several conspiracies among different communities. One that stood out the most was about the symbols carved on the wall of the buried structure. There was a discussion which claimed that these symbols were similar to the writings on an artifact that was unearthed in Egypt years ago. The artifact was said to be a fraction of a bigger piece, but the rest of it was never found, or so they thought. Archaeologists dismissed its historical value when they failed to identify its origin. but it has gone missing since then. There were only a few pictures of the fragment that could prove the conspiracy to be true. Oddly enough, the symbols etched on the stone were indeed fairly identical to the ones inside the court. However, the engravings were too vague, and the rest of it had to be found in order to make any solid conclusion. Since the dome was discovered, they also learned that the granite flooring was the top of a longer structure. The echo units revealed that there was a lower floor buried far beneath, and it was built with the same solid material. 2 more echo units were redesigned to excavate the dome. One was equipped with a high-powered drill, while the other was mounted with a compact laser cutter. Unfortunately, none of them were able to penetrate the solid stone. While the majority of the people were very interested to know more about the buried structure, there were a few who were strongly against it. According to them, the place might be sacred and should not be defiled. NASA was well aware that the place might be some kind of temple because of its design, and they were hoping that it was. If it was indeed a temple, there might be tombs on the lower floor like the temples of the past. Every 2 years and 2 months, we kept on sending more drones to Mars in order to broaden our scope and designate the activities more efficiently. There could be multiple reasons for a drone to give out, and only 1 out of 6 echoes went offline, which was still quite a favorable result for the company. A space station was built to orbit Mars and act as a base to receive the cargo pods from Earth, along with the excavators. Builder drones were also deployed. Capable of self-assembly, these innovative units could adjust and install their own hardware upgrades depending on the task at hand. When completely upgraded, the unit could grow more than 4 times its initial size and become fully capable of industrial construction. Since the dome was tightly enclosed, the level of solar radiation and cold were greatly reduced to a near tolerable level. It was a perfect location to build a campsite. And so they did. Solar panels were mounted outside of the court for power. Fortunately, the stone walls of the dome itself were not made of the same peculiar granite of the floor. A proper entryway was carved out, since the original door was inaccessible. Oxygen generators and other essential equipment for survival were installed. In 53 solar days, or approximately 8 weeks, a fully operational facility was built to prepare for the next milestone to humankind. On the next alignment of Earth to Mars, the first manned expedition was finally launched. In collaboration with other space agencies and the most innovative aerospace engineers of the time, the MA-1, or Martian Alpha 01 spacecraft was built. The most expensive and the very first vehicle bound for Mars with human passengers. The first group of astronauts to set foot on the red planet were Commander Pilot Lance Jefferson, Co-Pilot Jonathan White, Engineer Irvin Virgo, Physician Edward Reed, and Technician Andrew Zhang. Initially, the amount of time to reach Mars was approximately between 7 to 8 months, but with the help of the newest rocket technology, the Martian Alpha 01 was able to arrive at their destination in just 5.5 months. Everybody recognized it as one big leap for the history of mankind. When the safe landing was confirmed, the entire world celebrated for the success. They landed in the most ideal area in Flegramontes, about 20 miles from the Gord. Landing safely was just the beginning of their mission. Not only were they the first Earthlings to set foot on the red planet, but the crew of MA-1 were carefully chosen because these individuals were mentally and physically prepared to live in very different conditions for a long time. Unlike in a simulation training, to actually live millions of miles away from home on a dreary cold planet was unthinkable until then. Many things could go wrong since the landscape itself was unfit for habitation, with nothing outside but sand and rocks stretched as far as their eyes could see, and knowing that there was nobody else around, it was bound to be psychologically taxing for anyone. They were sent there to inhabit the red planet for the next 3 years, and endure any potential difficulties that they might face. MA-1's success was the needed prerequisite for the next mission. The crew were assigned to facilitate the site and establish a ground control system for the next ship. Back on Earth, NASA and the representatives of other space agencies were quite ecstatic to announce their next program to the public. The Mars Alpha 2 was already designed. It would be bigger than the first one since it would carry a heavier load. Along with more passengers, the second ship to fly to Mars had to transport resupplies and other additional equipment to improve the facility. The second group would consist of Commander Pilot and Soldier Albert Cade, Co-Pilot and Engineer Tanaka Yoshimoto, and Dr. Liam Davidson. This time around, scientists were included to conduct their research and studies on site. Biologist and representative of Mars Research Department, Stefan Weinberg, botanist and journalist Eliza Keller, and chemist Rowan Brown. The primary goal of the team was to find or make a sustainable resource essential for living on a red planet. In a nutshell, this second team was the first step for the ultimate goal, to colonize Mars. Zeal also developed a power-efficient 4-seat rover that could travel for 3 days before recharging. I designed the unit myself, and I was also part of the team that developed the Echo drones. Regardless of my inexperience in space, I was also chosen to join the second team as a technician and operator. Months had passed, and the first group who came to Mars were steadily making some progress. Although inefficiently equipped, they started building a few more smaller camps outside the Gord. Having some resting points that could at least protect them from the cold made it a little bit easier to move around from Arcadia to Elysium, the regions next to Flagramontes. Another place of interest in Mars was the largest volcano in the solar system called the Olympus Mons, which was estimated to be 3 times the height of Mount Everest. The group progressed toward its direction, and it was then when things became problematic. The group of Commander Lance were aiming to get closer to the giant volcano and establish a camp at a safe distance, but the reports about their progress were inconsistent and unclear. Following this irregularity, the satellite that was giving a visual to that area suddenly went offline for a few days. NASA said that it was only a technical difficulty, and they stated that the group had decided not to approach the Olympus Mons due to the potential hazards. But I knew that they lied. The Zeal was also receiving the feed from the Echo drones to monitor their performance, and we knew that the group were already at the foot of the volcano before the transmission was cut off. Any malfunctions on the satellites could also be fixed by our flight drones in the space station orbiting Mars. The only reason that it stayed offline was because they were purposely blocking the feed. Our company cannot contradict their statement since it might compromise our future projects and break the terms of our contract. A couple months before our departure, an unexpected addition to the team was announced. Archaeologist Wilbert Grant, who was known for his controversial theories and questionable discoveries, was suddenly given a ride to Mars. We trained and traveled back and forth to the ISS in order to prepare ourselves for the longest trip of our lives, and it was hard to imagine that someone without any preparation would suddenly jump the gun. However, there were rumors that he was also given the same training without our knowledge. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, Wilbert was the one who found the stone fragment with the Martian symbols years ago. Many people questioned this decision, but they simply brushed off the media and all the inquiries about the matter. Martian Alpha 2 was a month slower than the first model. Everybody tried their best to make the long trip more tolerable by socializing with one another. But the only one who chose not to engage in any conversation was the person we were curious about the most. Archaeologists love to share, or rather brag, about their work. It often only takes a few questions to make them talk for hours. But not Wilbert Grant. Not because he didn't want to. It was clear that he was ordered not to say anything based on his restrained reactions whenever we talked about the dome inside the court. With the exemption of Commander Pilot Cade, it was clear to everyone aboard that he knew something we didn't. It was expected for the leader of the crew to be briefed about every detail of the mission, but we were reluctant to force him to speak because of his position. I was already looking forward to landing on Mars and climbing the solar system's biggest volcano with my rover. And then, my curiosity was heightened with all the lies and secrecy that went on since the satellite went dark. When we finally arrived at the red planet, I was filled with both excitement and anxiousness. Our pilot landed perfectly at the designated area near the court. My knees were shaking as I stepped out of the ship and looked around. For a mere tinkerer like me who managed to slip into a big company, being on another planet was profoundly overwhelming. Dr. Liam helped me get rid of my nervousness when he saw my heart rate monitor. I was way over my head when I thought that I could be ready for this mission. With the endless sea of sand below my feet and a very different sky above me, there was this unshakable feeling that kept on telling me that I should not be there. It took a moment before I felt at ease and accepted the unearthly situation that I put myself in. But that was only the beginning of all the incredible things that I had to face. The first group escorted us inside the court, and seeing it in photos could not describe how intimidating it was to actually be there. I would say that I felt like a critter getting lost in a big stadium, but that would be an understatement. Walking inside the buried structure and seeing the empty giant throne felt like we were but a group of bugs invading a home of someone unimaginably greater. We humans always want to make things big that could match our dreams and illusions of grandeur. But we were humans of Earth. This place was a Martian territory. We weren't even sure if the civilization who lived there was anything close to the classification of a human. The crew of the first team showed us around as if the facility at the dome had become an indoor backyard. They had grown so used to the place after living there for a long time. The first team did not only accomplish their goals, they were able to find something that was even more valuable than the dome. As we were settling in, the pilot of the first group and Commander Kate discussed something with the archaeologist privately. A few moments later, I also got to see what they chose to hide from the rest of the world. They said they needed my rover to go to Camp 5, and so they needed me. Apparently, Camp 5 was the one at the foot of Olympus Mons, the last camp that they set before the Echo Drones' visuals were cut off from our company's feet. This giant shield volcano of Mars was formed by layers and layers of lava flow that accumulated for millions of years. And within those layers, they uncovered something unbelievably terrifying. I could only imagine how it would turn out on Earth if the gods that people choose to worship physically exist. Would these great entities be hailed as gods? Or would they be persecuted out of fear? Because of the creative minds of the literary geniuses from different centuries, we also have an inherent prejudice towards horned images. Coincidentally, this titan of a humanoid being right in front of me had 4. The first group discovered a well-preserved Martian corpse buried at the site of the volcano, and it looked nothing like I had imagined. Jitters crawled up my spine as my sweat fucked up my helmet while I stared at this behemoth in complete disbelief. Unlike me, the archaeologist's eyes were glimmering with excitement like a child. Almost half of the body was already dug out, and the drones were carefully carving out the rest of it. The 4-horned giant was in a sitting position with his knees against his chest. Despite the coiled posture, his sitting height was already at least 10 feet high. We initially thought that the gigantic door of the dome was merely a display of grand architecture, but this gigantic humanoid probably needed to crouch in order to pass through it. His 4 spiral horns were symmetrically positioned on his head, like a crown, a very fitting image of a king on a giant throne. We could assume that he lived in the dome, but the question was, why was he so far from it? It was also a mystery how he managed to be completely intact while being buried on layers of lava. It would take at least a week in order to carve him out of the volcano completely, and it was clear in Wilbert's face that he couldn't wait to take a closer look at the corpse. When we went back to the main camp, we all had to sign an NDA before the briefing. I could understand why they were so cautious about the mission's confidentiality after seeing it with my own eyes. Half of the second group belonged to different agencies from different countries, including me. Even though the expedition was a collaborative work, they simply did not trust us enough unless we were legally forced to keep our mouths shut. They waited until we arrived at the rat planet in order to make sure that we were isolated. All forms of messages coming in and out of the main facility were strictly monitored. Under these conditions, leaking any information would be next to impossible. The rest of the crew were finally informed about the real situation that we were dealing with. Apparently, the echo unit that we thought was already out of service was intentionally cut off from the network so it could operate discreetly. Its original task was to find any fossilized organic samples, but it found other things instead. Building small camps across the mountain range was not only meant to establish routes. Aside from the giant corpse, they also discovered a couple of caves with writings on the wall that looked similar to the ones in the dome. They specifically brought Wilbert Grant because he was the only person who had some knowledge about the matter. The stone with a similar Martian carving that was found in Egypt was not the only piece that Wilbert unearthed. He actually found the entire thing, but just like a few other discoveries with rather unique value, the artifact was marked as top secret. It was a round stone tablet, and the foreign symbols were in a circular row that looked like markers of a map. Wilbert traveled all over the world in hopes that he would find something in these marked areas, but he always went home empty-handed since the map was not of Earth. When the discovery of the dome was publicized, he finally realized what the markers meant. He was able to compare and decode some parts of the tablet by referencing the symbols inside the dome, and he shared this information to the Space Agency Coalition. His information had led them to the caves, and all of them were positioned to triangulate the dome. One was found in Arcadia, and the other one in Elysium. The third mark was supposedly in Olympus Mons, but they found the dead body of the giant Martian instead. Needless to say, the other members of the crew were flabbergasted about this new information. I assumed that our biologist, Stefan, was just playing along with the rest of us, since she was from NASA's own research department. But it seemed she knew nothing about the giant alien either. He tried to extract a tissue sample from the Martian corpse in order to analyze it, but no matter what method she used to extract the sample, nothing that we had could penetrate the skin. The giant's skin was impossibly tough. We even tried to drill a hole in its arm using the echo excavator units, but we couldn't even put a scratch on it. Everyone else proceeded accordingly in order to hide what we were actually doing. Tanaka was stationed in Camp 5 so he could look over the Martian corpse. Wilbert Grant was moving from one cave to another in order to figure out the writings on the wall. Wilbert might be right about the caves on Mars, but I personally wouldn't trust a man who also claimed that dragons and mermaids were real. Distrust became a common theme within the crew. Even though we were briefed about the discovery of the caves and the giant Martian, I could tell that there were still a few things that we weren't told about. We were sending 2 different reports back to Earth. One for NASA, which was also shared among the other space agencies. They were mostly findings from our scientists and a few clips from the roaming drones. Luckily for us, our local botanist was also a journalist that had her way with words. The other report was for a general stationed in Area 51, Nevada. They were mostly about the studies about the Martian and the decoding progress of the writings. I was but a glorified driver on the rat planet. Aside from hardware repairs on the echo drones that were too beat up to repair themselves, my daily job was to drop and pick up the crew from different camps or deliver what they needed. MA2 brought enough equipment to turn all the camps into breathable stations, and so we were able to stay outside the court for long periods of time if necessary. I also installed solar panels on each camp so they could serve as my charging stations for the rover. There were 5 active camps in total: the main camp inside the court, the Arcadia Station, Elysium Station, Camp 5, and the landing site. The only station that was not in line with the archaeologists' marked areas was the landing site about 20 miles southeast of the court, where a space pod was kept. Its main function was to drop some cargo from the space station in Mars orbit, but it could also carry us up there if necessary. We already brought enough resupplies that could keep us alive for 1,777 souls, or 5 Earth years. and so we covered the pot since we assumed that it would not be needed for quite a while. I could tell that the first crew were thankful to finally see some new faces around them. They treated us like visitors in their own home. Since they already knew more about the giant Martian and the peculiar caves, they were able to answer some of our inquiries as much as they were permitted to. They could have taken out the giant corpse off the rocks long before we landed, but it seemed that they waited for Wilbert's arrival for some reason before they proceeded. I had a feeling that there were other things about this confidential mission that even the commanders didn't know about. There were messages from Area 51 that only the archaeologist was allowed to see. Wilbert was on top of this project, and the commanders were his acting bodyguards. Despite our significant roles for this historical milestone to humankind, I felt like we were but a sideshow for the archaeologist's grand scheme. The Martian giant was finally carved out after 13 souls. We kept it around Camp 5 since bringing the body to the main facility would be very difficult. We built a large enclosure around it so they could study the corpse as close as they could. Once again, Wilbert was right. We discovered a third entryway when the body was removed. The giant leaned right against it, as if he purposely blocked it before he died. Or perhaps he was protecting it. Unlike the other two caves that looked like former shelters, the third one was bigger and appeared to be a sacrificial chamber. The chamber had features that were similar to the domes. There were 3 stone beds heavily embellished with intricate carvings of grotesque faces cramped together. They were arranged inside a circle etched on the floor with the same Martian writings. Surrounded by the beds was a stone altar at the very center of the circle. The walls of the chamber were filled with big faceless humanoid figures that looked as if they were actual beings embedded within the stone. Its odd location suggested that it existed long before Olympus Mons became significantly bigger. Like the curved walls of the dome, the entire chamber looked like it was carved from a single solid bedrock. The peculiarity of the room was both disturbing and captivating. It further confirmed that the Martians also had practices that were similar to the early days of humankind's civilization. After a few souls, Wilbert started acting strange. He became more withdrawn than he usually was, and he was easily getting angry when we tried to joke around with him just to lighten up the mood. We also noticed that he was whispering to himself, but we decided not to bother him anymore. As time passed, he became hostile. Aside from his ill-mannered behavior, rashes and boils started to show all over his body. The rest of us were quite alarmed because it might be contagious. This might severely jeopardize our mission and our well-being. Doctors Liam and Reed incessantly tried to check on his condition, but Wilbert strongly refused to be examined. When Reed finally had it with his behavior, he tried to restrain him on the bed. Wilbert lashed out and growled like a madman. He repeatedly attacked the doctor, who was only trying to help. Reed's face was bloodied from the punches and scratches. The archaeologist became so strong that it took 4 men to pin him down. He was screaming in a language that none of us could recognize. Others didn't want to say it, but I could tell that we all thought the same thing. Wilbert was possessed, and we didn't know how to deal with it. Liam had no choice but to sedate Wilbert and bind him on the bed. Reed's face and arms were filled with deep scratches and lacerations, as if he was attacked by a rabid animal. While we were discussing what to do with him in another tent, he managed to tear off the belt with sheer strength and got away. What baffled us the most was what happened next. Wilbert stormed out of the dome without any hesitation. He did not wear a suit, and yet he was able to run off in an atmosphere that should have killed him in less than a minute. We were about to chase after him with the rover, but then another problem unfolded in the facility. As I was preparing, I suddenly felt hazy and weak. I heard a couple of thuds, and then I saw Eliza and Rowan collapsed on the ground. The others immediately tried to aid them, but they also fell down like puppets that lost their strings. The last thing I saw was Tanaka rushing towards me, until I completely lost my consciousness as well. Incessant vomiting and high fevers were spread among the crew. Even the doctors themselves were doing their best just to stay on their feet since we needed them most. But they couldn't tell what was causing this sudden illness that affected all of us almost instantly. Furthermore, Stefan, Irvin, and Lisa were missing. As the acting hits of the crew, Lance and Kate dragged themselves forward and told me to prepare the rover. They said the 3 members were already gone when they regained their consciousness, and they also left their suits behind. We were definitely in no shape for a search mission. I was so weak that I couldn't stand without leaning on something. And then I saw Kate asking Dr. Liam for some drugs. They referred to it as the Go Pills, but I didn't know exactly what it was for until I took one along with the commander pilots. It boosted my energy and somewhat made me more alert. I reckon there was always a downside in taking enhancement drugs like this, but the situation called for desperate actions. I also bypassed the power-saving limiter of the rover to boost up its speed. Lance told us about his plan, and we agreed. The commander pilot of MA-1, Lance Jefferson, was assigned to keep a close watch over the archaeologist, and he was ordered not to mention whatever he might see to the other crew members. But due to the circumstances, he shared some of the things he had witnessed while looking after Wilbert. The archaeologist was able to decode the writings on the walls of the caves, and they always knew that there was a chamber behind the giant corpse. They waited for Albert to analyze the writings to make sure that it was safe to uncover it. The readings inside the chamber were quite erratic, and all of us who walked inside it also mentioned a heavy presence that they could not explain. On the other hand, Wilbert stayed in the chamber until he needed to resupply his gas. Lance kept on advising him to get some rest since he refused to sleep for days, but the archaeologist was easily agitated whenever he was confronted. He reported everything he noticed about Wilbert's change in behavior, but he was strictly ordered not to intervene with his actions. At some point, Lance realized that the archaeologist did not even recognize him anymore. And it was then when the incident at the main camp happened. He told us that the 3 missing crew might be in grave danger, and he had a very good idea where he might find them. Inexplicable events were happening one after the other. When we walked out of the court, we were greeted by thick dark clouds looming over the red planet. The air in Mars was so thin that you would barely hear a breeze, and yet it felt like a heavy storm was about to come. To make matters worse, our radios were jammed as if something was messing up the signals. We had to yell through our helmets and relied on hand gestures in order to communicate, while the whirring sands carried by the strong winds were dampening our line of sight. It felt like we were on a completely different planet. Or perhaps this was how Mars really was back in the day. The dreary and silent environment suddenly turned sinister and ferocious. Regardless of these unprecedented challenges, we had to proceed with our plan. To prepare for the worst, we dropped Kate on the landing site to set up the pod so we could launch ourselves to the space station if we had to escape. Lance revealed the contents of an unopened cargo, and he pulled out some guns. Both of us proceeded to Camp 5 near the chamber, and we were hoping to see the archaeologist and the others in there. Unfortunately, we were too late. When we arrived at Camp 5, the first thing that we noticed was the collapsed enclosure where we kept the giant Martian corpse. Profoundly perplexed, Lance and I were completely out of words when we discovered that the body was no longer there. We paused for a while as we looked each other in the eye. We rushed towards the chamber to see if our assumption was right. Stefan, Irvin, Liza, and Wilbert were all inside, and they were all dead. Wilbert's body was clinging to the altar. He was hardly recognizable due to the countless skin growths all over his severely dehydrated skin. The floor was covered in flaking blood that came from the 3 disfigured victims on the stone beds. Irvin, Liza, and Stefan were brutally murdered. Their chests were torn open with their rib cages forced apart on each side. Symbols were carved right on their hearts and on their foreheads. Some of them should have been able to escape if they were taken by just one man. Oddly enough, there were no indications that they tried to fight back. With the Martian corpse missing and our dead crew members in the sacrificial chamber, it was clear that they were sacrificed in order to bring the horned giant back to life. It was already quite puzzling how they all managed to get there without their suits. But what intrigued me the most was how a man from Earth was able to perform a complex ritual just by reading the writings on the walls. Even if he was able to analyze the symbols and their meanings, there was simply no way he could have known the actual language they were written in. None of these would have been possible unless Wilbert's body was overtaken by someone or something who knew exactly what he needed to do. Perhaps he was possessed by some kind of priest whose goal was to revive his god. Lance and I had no time to mourn. If the giant was awake, he would head back to his throne. Unfortunately, our bedridden friends were still in there with no idea of what was about to come. We drove back to the main camp as fast as the rover could take us, but we were not prepared for what we were about to confront. We initially thought that the only threat was the possessed archaeologist who kidnapped some of the crew. But then we had to face a horned giant with an impenetrable skin who withstood countless volcanic erosion for centuries. My body was trembling as we entered the dome with guns in our hands. It was the first time that I held a firearm, but it was also the first time that I felt so helpless. My body was frozen in fear as we saw the giant king sitting on his stone throne with his head resting over his palm, and the remaining members of our crew were standing at the edge of the ledge that was at least 20 feet high above the floor. Lance began to fire at the Martian until he was out of rounds, but this godly being remained completely unscathed. He lifted one finger, and the commander pilot standing in front of me was reduced to mincemeat with his suit shredded to 1,000 pieces in the blink of an eye. Totally overwhelmed and terrified, I fell to my knees and waited for my death. The king lifted a finger once again, and a portion of the floor opened up like a seamless puzzle folding inwards. A bottomless pit appeared on the floor. The lower level of the dome was a lid of an abyss that the Martian giant controlled. One by one, the remaining crew mindlessly leaped off the ledge and fell into the pit. When all of them were gone, the giant Martian suddenly spoke. His deep, intimidating voice echoed across the dome. I did not understand a single word he said, but somehow I could tell what he wanted to say based on his actions. I walked out of the dome in one piece, still in complete disbelief and deeply terrified of what I just witnessed. I went to the landing station and told Kate everything that happened. Perhaps it was the traumatized look on my face and the blood splatters on my suit which convinced them that I was telling the truth. We rode the pod and stayed in the space station. With just the two of us, we had enough supply in the station that kept us alive before the next team's arrival. I still do not know much about the true purpose of the secret mission that was given to Wilbert from Area 51, but it felt as if we were used as sacrificial pawns. There are too many questions that are left unanswered, but I'm just glad that I'm still alive. One thing was clear: Mars was not an uninhabited planet. Or rather, not anymore. Our curiosities had led us to reincarnate a godly king, which caused the deaths of the crew. Perhaps he thought that we were trying to invade, and I was spared to serve as a messenger for my people. He displayed his terrifying strength to let us know that his world was off limits, and we are not welcome.